An unknown grave, a sealed lead coffin, a man's identity forgotten to history. An archaeological discovery as unsettling as it was astounding.
I remember just looking and just thinking, oh my God.
Forensic science and detective work combine to solve a mystery 600 years in the making. Who was the man in the lead? The medieval world, the 5th to the 15th century. Tim Sutherland is one of Britain's most experienced archaeologists. He and a team of specialists try to understand medieval life by exploring the realm of the medieval dead.
We have a classic view of the storybook medieval life. We don't hear the stories about the common man trying to keep his family alive.
In our stores there are hundreds, if not thousands, of skeletons.
Archaeologically speaking, we can now focus in on the medieval dead people.
You're looking for clues in the skeleton all the time.
And you couldn't help almost look through their eyes thinking, what did they see? How did they die?
In 1981, the tiny hamlet of St. Bees in northern England became the scene of an astonishing archaeological discovery. A body was found, buried in a vault for hundreds of years. But instead of skeletonized remains, what they found was a shrouded, solid corpse. Nothing like it had ever been seen before. It was extraordinarily well preserved. And it provided a unique opportunity, telling us what life and death were like in medieval times. Who was St. Bees' man? The borderlands between England and Scotland have a turbulent and violent history. The medieval times were no exception. Raiding and conflict were facts of life for the people on either side, even as far south as the English Lake District. In the early years of the 14th century, landowning families here bore the brunt of wars with Scotland's William Wallace and Robert Bruce. At St. Bees, on the Cumbria coast, lies one of the largest priory churches in the north of England. In medieval times, it was an important place, busy with monastic life and large estates across the rugged hills. In 1981, it became the scene of an amazing archaeological discovery. A routine excavation was drawing to a close. Trainee archaeologists had uncovered a dozen or so graves of medieval monks or priors. Simple burials, just skeletons remained, as expected after centuries in the ground. But then they found something entirely unexpected. They came across the remains of an earth-filled burial vault deep beneath the priory's car park. It held two burials. One was a skeleton like the rest, but the other was in a lead coffin. The trainees had no way yet of knowing, but they'd made the archaeological find of a lifetime. A man buried hundreds of years before, yet preserved as though he died only weeks ago. The discovery of St. Bees' man became known among academics, but in an era before today's mass media, it hardly made the news outside the local area. When Tim Sutherland first heard it, the story had already become the stuff of archaeological legend.
I remember when I first heard about the St. Bees' man story. It was fascinating in that it hit the headlines, it was really big news, everybody was very excited. Then it sort of faded away and it became less famous, less well known, almost disappeared from the background of archaeological literature, etc. And then a few years ago, somebody came to me and said, have you seen this video of the autopsy? And I thought, this is amazing, it's 700 years old, an autopsy of an individual rather than a skeleton. And so I looked at the video and I thought, this is unbelievable. We need to know more about this individual. We need to find out more, and therefore we need to take it away from the underground sort of anonymity of it and back into the public perception about what happened, how important it was. Can we find out anything more about it?
Now, more than 30 years later, Tim heads north to St. Bees to find out more about the story. Ian McAndrew and Chris Robson are on hand to show him the dig site. The 1981 excavation wasn't the first. They remember how the investigations began originally on open ground, nearby the Priory Church.
Basically it starts with the dig, doesn't it? So
the one over in Priory Paddock?
Yes,
the first two.
Yes.
What year was that? Was that 1979?
1779 it would be, yeah.
So there was a dig here before they found anything significant? They were digging around the Priory?
There were two digs over in Priory Paddock.
Right, so what did they find? Did they find any structures?
A lot of water.
They were looking for the original monastic buildings on that side. In practice they didn't find very much of any interest. And then they came in the summer, it only rained, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And they said over there it was hopeless.
Right.
So they came here and thought, well, okay, here's a car park.
It'll be drier.
It'll be drier. They were trying to find stuff here, and it was hopeless because they had to go down about 3 feet.
Well, at least that.
Then they got down to the monastic burial level and found,
in this area here?
Yes, right. In this area here, and found a prior, bones of a prior with a chalice, which was somewhere here. Mm-hmm. And then
most of those were over on that side.
Yeah.
But were they quite condensed in terms of the number of burials per square metre?
I think there were about 12 burials, if I remember rightly.
The car park area where they dug had once been the site of the medieval priory's south chancel. Little was known about this, apart from when it was demolished. This enabled the archaeologists to establish a rough date for the burial of the lead coffin.
This was a south chancel, and that south chancel fell down in about 1500. So in fact you would say, okay, this body has to predate 1500.
Right,
so
because you want to bury somebody outside in that manner.
Right. So you
it wouldn't be outside, it'd be inside the chancel.
But once the chancel had fallen down.
So you could almost on that bit of paper say age unknown, but pre-1500.
Pre-1500.
He's seen the site as it is today. But to learn exactly what the dig uncovered, Tim visits the University of Leicester. Deirdre O'Sullivan was the lead archaeologist. The original dig plans and drawings are a mine of information.
The other monastic burials were mostly in this area, but we had burials of both phases in this area.
So who excavated St. Bees Man? Was that you or?
Well, a variety of people uncovered the coffin. We had to lift it first, and that was quite a big job because it was very, very heavy. And so it was lifted out of the vault and then taken to a space just off site. And then Malcolm opened it up and I heard this, and then there was a strange smell that wafted over the faces. Well, the smell wafted over the air, and the faces of people all went. And I remember just looking and just thinking, oh my God. Because when he lifted the coffin lid, or the bit that he'd cut off, there was this body in a shroud. And I had no idea, no expectation at all. Ian McAndrew, who is a local doctor who was standing on the spoil heap with great stamina, filming it all, he made the suggestion that the local morgue in West Cumberland Hospital in Whitehaven might be able to accommodate it.
It was realised that something had to be done to preserve this, but they didn't have any facilities to do so. And it was lucky that I happened to be there that day, because I had contacts in the hospital through professional contacts. So I said, excuse me, I know where there's a big fridge.
It's lucky Ian McAndrew was present that day for another reason. He had with him his Super 8 home movie camera, but he had little idea that this would enable him to capture a unique moment during the excavation.
I didn't always carry the Super 8 camera with me, so I had some inclination or indication that there was a significant find. And I took the camera down with me for that. Must admit that I didn't expect what we did find.
Ian's footage is a priceless record of the moment the heavy lead coffin was lifted from the grave.
This is the other side of that dig area where they found various monastic burials. Yeah,
I've seen the pictures of the autopsy, but this is, to actually watch an excavation from 1981 is fantastic, but of an excavation that's so important is unbelievable. I can't believe that you or anybody else had the foresight to walk up to that site and start taking a cine film of it.
I think at this stage we probably didn't realise how important it was because we hadn't opened the coffin.
True.
It wasn't until we opened
True.
it the panic started in a way.
So that's uncovering the lead coffin.
Basically uncovering it.
This is as it happened, as it came out of the ground, or as he came out of the ground.
And that's when we opened it. When we opened the lid after being cut open by the still.
That's unbelievable, isn't it?
Deirdre O'Sullivan and the crowd of villagers look on transfixed as the coffin is opened for the first time in nearly 700 years.
So St B's man is lying there, the lead has been peeled off the top, and you can see him, and you can see the state of the preservation in terms of the lead and the cord. So it's unbelievable, really.
It was now that Ian's suggestion of the big fridge led to the body being sent to a nearby hospital morgue. It was a race against time to preserve the corpse before it began to decompose, but as they found out, hospital red tape couldn't be bypassed.
It was slightly bizarre because, of course, the hospital mortuary technician insisted on going through the normal procedure of admitting a body and asking it name, don't know, place of death. Well, we found him in St B's, but we don't know where he died. Age, no idea, but he was found just yesterday, but we think he must be at least 700 years old. And so it went on, trying to fit this thing into modern admission techniques, which resulted in a somewhat bizarre conversation at the hospital.
The hospital photographic department had a U-matic video camera, state-of-the-art for 1981. As well as Ian's footage of the coffin opening, there would also now be an audio-visual record of something completely unique. The autopsy of a man, his body miraculously preserved, who had lived and died almost 7 centuries before. Dr. Eddie Tapp performed the post-mortem. Ian McAndrew and Deirdre O'Sullivan were both present. Right from the start, they were all staggered at the degree of preservation they found.
When he was finally exposed and you saw his face, it was really amazement that it was so well preserved. The fact that you could still see the pupils, you could see the iris. There were details that you could see in this body that to find them in something that had been buried for so many years was really quite astounding.
This was the face of a medieval man. His beard and skin were stained by thick pine resin that had been smeared all over the linen shroud. He was about 40 years old. Archaeologists are used to skeletons, but this was something entirely different.
I dug up dozens of skeletons myself, planned and recorded them, and have dug up some more since. At no time have I ever encountered anything like soft tissue, never mind a preserved body, and my expectation would be that such a thing was not within, to put it mildly, the normal run of events of what you'd expect to find in a medieval cemetery.
Deirdre could only look on as the autopsy continued. It seemed the remarkable state of preservation wasn't confined to the body's exterior. This is the moment Ian and the pathologists looked inside the chest cavity.
Look at this, Bill. Bill, just have a look at that. Is that blood?
Liquid red blood, hardly congealed, still visible inside a centuries-old cadaver. An important clue later as to the cause of the man's death.
The liver was sliced in 2 or 3 places, and as we watched, you could see the first slice, second slice, third slice, and the last slice was pink. The slice that had been done first, which was probably, I don't know, maybe a minute or so earlier, was brown. So you could really, as you watched, you could see this slow colour change from going from pink through to brown. And this was the effect of the oxygen in the air oxidising the tissues.
From the internal organs and intestines, they found no disease or infection. And from the stomach contents, they could discern his last meal: oats and raisins, a kind of porridge. The man had been in good health at the time of death. But it's when they looked at the man's bones that they began to gain a clearer insight into how he might have died.
His jaw was fractured in 2 places, so he had received a blow to his jaw. He'd had these fractured ribs, so he must have received a blow to the chest cavity. So these were the 2 main injuries that he had.
The fractured ribs and the blood found inside the chest cavity were clues as to a probable cause of death.
The fractured ribs he had actually punctured the lung, or the lining of the lung. A pneumothorax, as the condition is called, is likely to be fatal if it's not treated fairly promptly. You can survive it, but it's unlikely. In the case of St. B's man, he not only had the pneumothorax, but he'd also been bleeding into the chest cavity. So he had a hemothorax as well. And this is really what killed him.
Fractured jaw, fractured ribs, a punctured lung. His death had been painful. But how had it happened? There was no obvious indicator as to how the injuries had been caused. Massive blunt force trauma, yet no direct evidence of a weapon, such as a blade or a spear. But there was hardly time to speculate before procedure had to be followed and the body returned to the grave.
It couldn't occupy the morgue in West Cumberland Hospital at the expense of the National Health Service, and we certainly didn't have any facilities in Leicester for that. So it seemed the best thing to do.
With simple ceremony, the man in the lead was reinterred at St. B's, where he still lies to this day. But who he was remained a mystery. The forensic research was over. The historical just beginning.
Local historian John Todd was driving the history, driven by the question at the mortuary. Name, please.
John Todd set about finding a named individual, important enough to be buried in a prestigious place in the South Chancel. Could he have been a clergyman like the other burials? It seemed unlikely, given that he was buried alongside a woman, and the clergy were forbidden to marry. It seemed he had to be from one of the noble families in England, probably in the mid or late 14th century. But which?
The first choice was a man called John de Harrington, who died, I think, 1298, who was the first option for St. B's man.
As well as the Harringtons, John Todd also favoured the de Lucy family. Sir Anthony de Lucy was known to have owned lands around St. B's, and he became the prime candidate.
The problem was the lady. The vault had been extended, and therefore the lady had died after the man. Harrington's wife, in fact, predeceased him, so that was a real problem. But de Lucy, his wife, was known to have died in London, aged 70, so she didn't fit either.
Anthony's wife remarried, and so would not have been buried with him. This led John Todd to think, what if the bones were of another family member? Anthony's daughter died as an infant, but his sister, Maud de Lucy, was one of the richest and most powerful women in the north of England at this time. Her remains weren't reburied with St. B's man. Now she's known simply as Skeleton SK100. Another important discovery made by local researcher Doug Sim now seemed to back up John Todd's theory. Among the stones at the priory was a fragment of heraldry. It showed the arms of the de Lucys quartered with the Percys, another prominent family. The only time this could have happened was when Maud, heir to the de Lucy fortune, married into the Percys. SK100, it seemed, was Maud. In which case, St. B's man, it seemed, was Sir Anthony de Lucy. De Lucy was known to have died in 1368, fitting the profile of an important man buried in the south chancel before 1500. He owned large estates elsewhere, yet St. B's seemed important to him, perhaps a spiritual home. As a knight, he was no stranger to action. He'd fought the Scots on the English borders, where he might possibly have sustained his last injuries. Yet just then, it seemed the trail would lead no further.
And then, very unfortunately, almost at the same time, John Todd had a heart attack and died very suddenly. It was an enormous loss to to everybody. You know, he was Mr. History.
Chris Robson carried on the research John Todd had begun. He knew there was one problem with confirming once and for all the man in the lead as Anthony. De Lucy was recorded as having died overseas. If this was true, how could he be buried at St. B's in England?
In the medieval period, you just don't send people home over a long distance from overseas. The impracticalities of it are just immense. Obviously, you would need a huge amount of money, so unless you were a king or a very important person, it just didn't happen. And of course, they didn't have refrigeration units. You couldn't send a body home in deep freeze. They would have to be sent home wrapped in a condition that they would stand at least some chance of arriving home intact.
The body was wrapped in resined linen inside the lead, but it hadn't been deliberately embalmed for preservation like an Egyptian mummy. The intestines were not removed. How could the body have survived weeks or even months on such a long journey home? There were many questions to be answered. A clue lay in something else found by the pathology. At the time, it caused Ian and the others some alarm.
Over the whole of the internal organs, there were sort of little yellow granules. This caused a certain amount of concern because there is a condition called miliary tuberculosis, and it does produce this appearance of little yellow dots all over organs. And of course the concern was, well, if the body has survived this long, what about the bacteria? So it did give us a little bit of worry at the time. It turned out to be crystals of adipocere. This was found out later on.
Adipocere occurs in archaeological bodies when certain conditions combine. Moisture trapped within the resin shroud reacted to a change in temperature, stopping decomposition. It kept St. B's man almost in suspended animation, preserved as if his death had only just taken place. It was plausible, after all, that he could be Anthony de Lucy. Chris's curiosity was renewed.
After John's death, I felt there were the aspects of the story which were incomplete, and there was a question of tidying up loose ends. And then what happened was the loose ends, instead of being tidied up, unravelled and spread in all sorts of different directions.
John Todd had found that de Lucy may have died on crusade, but the days of the Palestine Crusades were long gone. By the 14th century, a crusade just meant wherever Christians fought pagans. De Lucy went north to Prussia. Financial records detailed de Lucy's preparations for the crusade, with a party of other English knights, including one named John de Moulton.
John de Moulton and Anthony de Lucy both borrowed money from the same person within a week of each other. It was stated that John de Moulton was going to Prussia. It was not stated where Anthony was going. It was thought they were probably going together. And John Todd thought, well, it's almost probable, but certainly you can't prove it.
It was then that one of the amazing twists that characterised the story happened. Among papers relating to John de Moulton was a letter. And at last Chris found what he'd been looking for.
And then suddenly this letter turns up in Magdalen College, Oxford, written by John de Malton to his wife in November 1367, saying, "Dear wife, I am going with my friend Anthony de Lucy to Prussia." And you think, wow, where's that been? Suddenly you have written evidence that the two were going.
The letter was a major leap forward. For the first time, there was evidence that de Lucy made a journey abroad in the year before his death, 1367. At Magdalen College, Chris meets with Robin Darwell Smith. He's come to see for himself the letter, carefully preserved among thousands of other documents.
Welcome to Magdalen's Muniment Room.
Wow.
Well, this is state-of-the-art archival storage circa 1480. I am doing the same job here that my predecessors have been doing for hundreds of years. And this cupboard contains documents about Malton Hall. And we took this out some years ago and flattened it for better conservation. And so here it is. And it's a letter from Sir John de Malton to his wife, written in 1367, just before he's going off on crusade in Prussia.
This is extraordinary. This is almost, I think this is almost the first time that somebody who is associated with St. Bees has actually come in direct contact with the letter, which tells this extraordinary story.
Now it's all in medieval French. I'll try to translate. So, chère compagne, dear companion. I do like that way he talks to his wife. That's rather affectionate and formal manner all at once.
It is in fact very personal, isn't it?
Yes. So sachez, know that Anthony de Lucy and me and all our company are taking our journey to the parts of Sprus, it says, but that's Prussia.
Prussia, yes.
So that's the important bit. They are on their way to Prussia.
Yes. With, of course, a date.
Yes, the date is down here, given at London. There it is, the Feast of St. Clement. Can you see?
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
St. Clement's Day, the 23rd of November. The letter proves Anthony de Lucy was heading for Lithuania. For John de Malton, it was a last goodbye to his wife and a home he would never see again. For Chris also, the letter is tinged with sadness.
Our local historian, John Todd, was searching for this documentary evidence for year after year after year, thinking it must be somewhere. And he's not here to see it.
Oh dear.
Because he died, sadly, some years back. Always thinking, sometime this documentary evidence will turn up. So there's a sort of double sadness.
Yes.
Chris now had the strongest case so far to believe the body in the lead was Sir Anthony de Lucy. Now, as he delved deeper into what was known about the man, he found de Malton and de Lucy and their party would not have been alone when they reached Prussia. They were with the most renowned fighting men in Europe at that time, the Order of the Brothers of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem, the Teutonic Knights. For Chris, the story had become even more intriguing.
And I then get in contact with the people the historians, say, I think we've got the possibility of, somebody called Anthony de Lucy who might have joined the Teutonic Knights. And eventually I get hold of Tim Gard, who's written his book, and he says, oh, Anthony de Lucy, I'll look him up in my notes. I thought, wow, you know about this guy. I thought he would say, who?
Chris contacted me with an email asking if there was a connection. He felt there should be a connection explored between what he'd discovered and what was known about the St. Bees man and my work on the Crusades in the 14th century. And at first I was sceptical. I wondered deeply whether this was just a sort of a romantic attachment, but having looked into it and agreed to go and talk to the St. Bees history group, the evidence started to pile up, and the connections I felt were strong enough to warrant really serious investigation.
Tim Gard has made a careful study of the accounts of 14th century English noblemen who fought for Christianity. It's given him an insight as to why apparently so many of these knights found it compelling to join the campaigns in the Baltic, in what became known as the Northern Crusades. Since the 1190s, when the Crusades to Palestine and the East began to falter, Christians had taken the fight closer to home, Northern Europe and the Baltic, where paganism still flourished. The Teutonic Knights were the dominant Christian force propagating the Crusades. But by the 1360s, they were overstretched and relied on knights from different Christian countries to bolster their ranks. For chivalric honour, spiritual well-being as they saw it, or simple military experience. Especially for English knights like de Lucy, in times of relative peace closer to home, when there was little prospect of war with France.
For men like de Lucy, who perhaps had not had the chance to fight in the grand campaigns like Crécy and Poitiers, the 1360s are a sort of still time. You're fully aware, you're fully conscious of the reputations that have been built under Edward III and his famous armies, and you're itching for an opportunity yourself.
Sometimes they went off to join the Teutonic Knights almost as a holiday, I think, in the sense that they'd go out there possibly for 6 months simply to join in the fighting. They would come back with the prestige of being a crusader. Some of them went off for spiritual reasons, but some went off for the pride of the family, and in some senses to come back with a ticket saying, of course, I've been a crusader and therefore in fact I have less time in purgatory. There's a nice letter from somebody, a French knight, saying in fact he went to join the Teutonic Knights for a particular time because at that time he wrote, "The fighting is good."
Anthony de Lucy, with his background fighting border skirmishes with the Scots, may well have looked forward to his time with the Teutonic Knights with the same relish. He probably arrived in Lithuania by boat, along the Niemen River, sometime in early 1368.
But in fact it was made easy for them to travel. The fighting was in fact in the winter when it was frozen and you could go across marshlands without too much difficulty. You then had a break for Christmas and then fighting took place in the summer when it was nice and dry, and again you didn't get bogged down because the geography of that area is quite awful.
Heading out into the Lithuanian wilderness on a resa or raid, de Lucy was probably on horseback with other knights, supported by dismounted infantry as they searched for pagans to attack, either soldiers or any civilians unwise enough not to have fled. Pitched battles were very few and far between. Mostly the fighting was in short, vicious skirmishes, or most often, sieges. Sometimes the fights were arranged by the Teutonic Knights for the martial enjoyment of their guests, whose financial support they desperately needed. Most of the time, they did not expect to lose. But as Anthony de Lucy found out, sometimes a crusade did not go according to the divine plan.
I think it's great that after 30 years, Chris can go back into the footsteps of a man who visited Lithuania 700 years ago and see the same sort of places that he saw, get the same sort of feeling about the landscape and what it was like to exist and fight and potentially die there 700 years ago.
More than 3 decades after the man in the lead was uncovered, another St. Bees man now travels to Lithuania. From what historians have pieced together, it's here that de Lucy and the other English knights came, Kaunas, Lithuania. 50 kilometers west of Vilnius, Kaunas Castle guards the confluence of two important rivers, the Niemen and the Neris. In the 14th century, this was the front line, strategically important to both sides. And it's here, somewhere, that de Lucy met his fate.
Anthony de Lucy was here in August, possibly September. We think he died in August, and here we are in August. Yeah, the sunshine, the same sunshine, same sort of birds that we look round, we see the river. We get a feel for him. We can't see his footsteps, but we can sort of think about it. And I think that's absolutely fascinating and also an enormous privilege.
The castle was besieged and changed hands several times during the 1360s, neither side ever being able to fully break the deadlock as the war on the frontier stalemated. The result was attritional warfare, bad enough for the combatants, horrendous for the local population. David Nicol has written many books on medieval warfare. He's travelled to Kaunas with Chris to help understand what de Lucy may have experienced here. The castle is now a museum. From archaeology carried out during the restoration, it's been possible to put together an accurate idea of the scale, detail, and sheer savagery of the fighting. After a month-long siege in spring 1362, the castle here was taken by the Teutonic Knights. Of a garrison of hundreds, all but 3 were killed. But the area was too important for the Lithuanians to give up. And a few years later, they established another castle just 5 kilometers away. New Kaunas Castle was of timber and earth, rather than stone and brick. Once more, the Teutonic Knights vowed to attack. From their base on the Niemen River, they launched another siege campaign. Surviving accounts suggest it's this campaign in which de Lucy and the English knights took part, alongside their Teutonic brothers.
What actually happens? What are the rules, as it were?
I don't think there are any rules at all at this stage, certainly not when you're fighting against pagans, because siege warfare was always the most brutal, because there was least possibility of honour. Siege warfare, the equivalent of trench warfare for their period. The closing stages of a medieval siege, if the garrison of the castle does not surrender, are going to be the most brutal and bloody time, because that's when the two sides come hand to hand. If they fight on until the enemy, the attackers, break in, then by the laws of war, and there were no laws as such, but the customs, the accepted code of behaviour, is if you had to actually fight your way in, you didn't have to give quarter. They had sacrificed their right to surrender because they hadn't surrendered before you broke in. They left it too late. It's nasty, it's brutal. There are people with their bones getting broken and limbs cut off. And if the Crusaders, the Teutonic Knights, break in, there is going to be slaughter.
Medieval warfare in all its forms was lethal. There's no way to be sure exactly how de Lucy received his fatal injuries.
So, given the injuries which we know he had, it's a severe blow to the side of the head or to the side of the face, breaks his jaw. He is a high status man, he's going to have a really good helmet. Now, whether he has a visor to protect his face is debatable, because they always had to choose between protection of the face and not being able to see practically anything, or good visibility but you're open to facial injury. He gets a bash to the side of his head. Now, that either he falls over onto something from some height, breaks his ribs, punctures his lung, eventually dies. Now, if he's wearing armour or a coat of plates, that could well prevent a cut, but would not prevent the break, because a coat of plates it's like a modern bullet armour. The plates, the actual armour itself, can still go into you and break your ribs.
All that remains is to make a final pilgrimage. The exact location of New Kaunas is now lost. Chris and David head out to see for themselves the wilderness in which it stood. Somewhere near here was the scene of de Lucy's last fight.
So this would be about as close as we're ever going to get. to New Kaunas.
Yes.
And one look back to 1368 and say, well, somewhere here is where he died.
Yes.
But goodness knows where.
What happened that day won't ever be known for sure, but it ended in the deaths of de Lucy and 2 other English knights, and very likely many more on both sides. Chris's research has helped him draw some kind of understanding of a story which he and others have been researching for decades.
When I started trying to understand the de Lucy story, I thought that it was a few strands had to be wrapped up together. And as you wrap up the strands of the story, you realise in fact it simply unravels on you. And it keeps on unravelling. So I suspect it will continue to unravel. I don't think we'll ever get to. I always thought there would be at some point a final full stop. And then we'd say, finished. But I was told firmly by my wife, history never has a full stop.
More than 30 years after the initial excavation in the 1980s, we can piece all this information together and we can tell the original story about what happened to St Bees man.
Sir Anthony de Lucy, an English knight of the mid-14th century, who'd fought in skirmishes against the Scots, who'd mortgaged land or property to join the Northern Crusades, either for his soul, for the military experience, or simply the honour. But there was little glory in the bitter siege fighting at Kaunas. In a landscape blasted by years of war, he heard he was to take part in an attack on a new pagan fort. From the injuries on his body, he may have been in the thick of the fighting, perhaps eager to break through the defences, be the first over the wall. But the defenders are too strong. They know they'll be slaughtered if they don't hold out. And they're fighting for their country, on home soil. The attack stalls. De Lucy is hit. A heavy blow fractures his jaw. A fall in armour breaks his ribs and punctures his lung. Brother knights or infantrymen drag him away, shielding his body as the fort's defenders rain down arrows to harry the retreat. He's evacuated by boat, back down the Niemen River. Perhaps he makes it, perhaps he dies on the water. He's a foreign knight who sacrificed his life for the cause. The Teutonic Knights perhaps intend to bury him with honours, yet his surviving friends or servants honour a pledge or a last request. The body is wrapped in a linen shroud, sealed with resin, then encased in lead. He's then returned home, across the sea, back to the beautiful wild hills of the north of England, where once again he lies to this day.